Well, welcome back. Welcome back to that slightly delayed first comfort break. All down to me, my bad, and my apologies. My name's Rob Neal, and I'm your MC throughout the day. And I'm here to introduce your next speaker. If you've arrived here, it's because you've chosen to listen to the wonderful Richard Hillsdon, and more about that in a moment. Before we get to Richard, really quickly, under the on-demand button, there are all sorts of treasures waiting for you to enjoy. There's some videos, there's some tips on how you might want to go about networking and conducting yourself in virtual conferencing, all sorts of stuff that Dods have put together for you to enjoy. I should also mention that today's event is in partnership with FDA, the First Division Association, that senior civil servant union that provides support for those individuals. Don't forget the hashtag that you can tweet on, hashtag BAME IL for Into Leadership. And you can catch this organization on Twitter. It's at BAME_leadership, at BAME_leadership. So to our next session, lasting for an hour. So do pace yourselves, but rich in content, because the heading here is preparing for your next role. Are you ready for promotion? Now, I first bumped into Richard in Birmingham, it was. I walked into this BAME Into Leadership conference. I don't mind telling you, colleagues, BAME Into Leadership, Black, Asian, Minority, Ethnic into Leadership. And I saw this white guy at the stage, on the stage. I didn't even give him a chance. I just thought, well, what's he doing here? Is he lost? Has he misread the directions? And so I listened. I listened for about a minute and a half, and I was completely engaged. He was speaking to the heart of the issue around recruitment, around techniques, around algorithms, and the detail and how you put your best foot forward. He's overflowing with information and detail, an expert around success profiles, that new way of recruitment, or relatively new, to deliver a more inclusive workforce. I consider him a new friend, but a wonderful friend. Richard, over to you for the next hour.
Thank you very much indeed, Rob. How can I follow that? I think I'm going to try and overcome what you're seeing right now is another white guy, but he's got grey hair as well. He's a sort of visual aid of the problem, if you like, and indeed that's true, because that's often what we're going to have to change in lots of ways, exactly as Paul was talking about earlier. I'm going to, hopefully, my first wonderful move, if I can live up to that, is to share my slides with you, and I hope that this will work, okay? And you can all see the slides. I imagine you can. All right, well, this is 2 sessions I'm going to do. One a little bit later in the morning. Maybe you're not going to come to both, but they do actually fit end to end, because I'm dealing with the whole recruitment process, starting really from the appetite to go for a job, right the way through to the interview and hopefully success. But you'll be able to see the slides in any case, even if you can't or don't want to attend both of them. So I'm going to talk about preparation. There's going to be some polls during this, so I'm going to find out what you think. I'm not going to say anything really much about me, because you can read all that, except to say that I spent the last 2 years, in fact more than that, on spending the time around the country training and talking and working with people over the success profile system, and experiencing what vacancy holders and applicants think of it. But prior to that, I've had at least 25 years of working with selection as an occupational psychologist originally, but then a policy civil servant. So I'm going to take you through all this, and what's my position here? Well, let's just see that the okay. Whoopsie. Okay. What does being prepared practically mean? Some ways to make it hard for them to reject you. Taking yourself seriously, I think, is the message here, because this is your moment. Maybe you don't think so, but my sense of all this is that the diversity agenda is now really here. And I work with lots of people and work with BAME development programs and so on. So I get a kind of sense of where this is. But along the way, what I'm going to be talking about is the unconscious bias aspects of all this. What has got to change from their side of the table, but also what has got to change from your side of the table. Because I hope you don't think this is flippant, but you've got to play the game their way up to a point, and then expect that there will be some openness and change coming from the other side, some of which has arrived and some of which perhaps hasn't. And if I turn to my next slide, this is my first poll question to you. How confident are you now of your future progression in the civil service? I don't think that's a very linear scale, but not confident, not very confident, unsure, maybe confident, very confident. Would you like to just rate yourself? Think hard about it. Don't just put unsure or not confident at all, unless you really mean it. Let's see how you all feel. So I'll kind of sit tight and wait and see what emerges from that in terms of the percentages of the audience here. And I think that's a measure really of whether you think it's your moment or not.
So in terms of the results you have, 8% are not confident at all, 42% may be confident, 31% not very confident, 8% very confident, and 11% unsure.
So how many were maybe confident?
38%.
I regard that as quite encouraging. That but 42% not confident at all. I think you said, Claire. Yeah. Yeah.
10% not confident at all.
Sorry, 10%. I apologize, and then 42%. That's right. So not confident at all. Maybe we have made some progress. Okay. The next poll I want to do with you is I've listed here. We had a webinar back on the 7th of October, at which we invited the senior civil service and grade 6s and 7s, maybe some of you were on it, and talking about the workforce of the civil service of the future. And I put down what are 7 or so drivers, if you like, for what those what the civil service might be recruiting for. What will be the kind of things that will drive it? And I'd like you to rank these, because they include, of course, BAME, gender, and all the rest of that. But there are many other factors as well that you'll be only too well aware of, I'm sure. So would you like to rank those right now?
16% for levelling up, as well as hybrid working. 12% for more fixed term hiring from outside the civil service, as well as moving the civil service out of London and people looking for well-being. With 15% for practical skills and 18% for more specialism and professionalism. So that 18% more specialism and professionalism is the first, the top priority that was identified, followed by levelling up, hybrid working as well, then practical skills, and then people looking for well-being.
I think it's really quite even and in many ways. And so all those are recognised as major drivers. And I think this is what faces us. This is all the things that are going to be juggling us in departments and across the civil service, alongside the diversity and inclusion agenda, which we all know about, and of course accelerated by working from home as we are right now, and indeed, remote working generally. Okay, I'm going to I put one slide on here just to remind you of the success profile system, which is now 2 years old. It's a slide from the Cabinet Office, which simply lists the 5 elements, but also all the different kind of methods that might be used. And of course, we know that the elements are all separate and scoreable, and in the hands and in the control of vacancy holders is exactly how to juggle those and how to apply them, provided, of course, that they've got a real handle on what the job is all about. And I want to return to that idea shortly. I've called this my Are You Ready quiz, because I'm talking to you really as people who I assume are applying for jobs or interested in promotion, although many of you probably sit on the other side of the table as vacancy holders, sifters or interviewers as well. But as applicants, there are 5 questions that I think are at the heart of this. When I've lived and breathed this stuff for a couple of decades now, the first thing is a CV. A lot of civil servants haven't had CVs before. They filled out application forms and they put CV-like entries, but they haven't necessarily had a free-form CV. I know that because I often ask them if they've got a CV, and they say, well, no, I've got application forms. Do you have an okay CV? And the question really is, what is an okay CV? Then what would you put in a personal statement? Because there's much more emphasis on that now, because it's, of course, much more free form. You're not just answering 6 big competencies in 250 words. So do you know how to write a behavior example? And where does the new kid on the block strengths come into this? And finally, of course, if you can get through the SIFT, could you impress at the interview? And I'm going to go through each of those, starting with the CV. And here we've got poll number 3. I want you to rate your CV in whatever shape. Don't be shy. No one's going to know. But being honest about your CV, and you'll see that the kind of choices I've given you are quite sort of pointed, really. You know, if you really haven't got one that you could use, my test is, what shape is it in right now if I asked you to email it to me? Would it be usable? Would it be not up to date? Would it be poorly laid out? Would it probably be a bit of a dull, flat read because you haven't really sort of jazzed it up? Or are you actually quite proud of it? Would you like to have a think about that and assess your CV?
Oh, it turns out top vote at 29%. It's all there, but probably a dull read, tied with I'm quite proud of it. So both at 29. 21%, I have one, but it's not up to date. At 21%, 13%, I don't have one that's at all usable, followed by 8%. I have one, but it's poorly laid out.
Thank you. I'm really encouraged by that, because don't worry if it's dull read, because you can turn it into something whenever you're going to use it for real. But the fact that you haven't been, all of you, been lured by it's not up to date or it's poorly laid out or unusable for all sorts of reasons, this is good, because it's my view that you need a CV, you need a base of this. And I just going to spend a minute or two on that. You may be asked only to fill out an application form, and the fact that the application form may be quite factual, although some departments now are changing application forms so that it asks you to assess your achievements, for example. So there is some element of self-assessment in it. But what's so important is, if you're not proud of it, if you don't look at it and think, gosh, have I done that? Why would they be impressed by it? And this is not a CV writing course, but at the heart of this is something like this. This is an actual example of what might appear in the middle third of the front page of your CV, a summary of career achievements, experience and strengths. You could, of course, call that summary of career achievements, behaviours and strengths. It's up to you what you want to title it. But the idea that you will look back over your career in the last 5, 10 or 15 years or whatever it is and decide, what does it amount to? What am I offering the market? And here is somebody, grade 7, I think, there's a version. It would actually have some words underneath it, and of course will be unpacked in more detail in both the CV and indeed probably in a personal statement as well. But thinking about those, and of course you can tailor those to fit closely as you possibly can to the essential criteria for the job. But having that, it's a bit of a struggle to produce something like that. You'll have to wrestle with yourself. But at the end of it, you should think, oh, that's really important, because then you can put your shoulder behind it. So, question 2, what do they want in a personal statement? Personal statements have now assumed a much greater importance. Now you're not writing just 6 times 250 words for competencies, which you were a few years ago. You now have this blank screen with a whole stack of essential criteria, usually. You might even have some behaviours attached to them or woven into them. HMRC, for example, went through a period of putting the behaviour headings on the front end of the essential criteria. Fine, provided the wording isn't going to argue with the behaviours booklet, for example. Are you there to put some self-assessment in there to assess yourself, not just put flat star-based kind of answers down there that you boned up, 2 nights ago? And what about strengths? Some people who've come in from inside the civil service will look carefully, because they're used to having interviewed by strengths, and decide that some of those strengths are kind of woven into the essential criteria, and they'll make reference to them in their application. But writing a statement, and I thought that I would do what I did at Civil Service Live last year and actually show you a couple of real examples that, I'm sorry about the lots of words, but this is an actual personal statement entry for the criteria and ability to grasp complex issues, identify relevant implications and risks. And I thought I'd show it to you as an example of something that is trying to do this effectively, but not really succeeding. We can't have a conversation about this, but I'm going right now, but we can in the question period. And I'm going to certainly show you in my second presentation of the morning what makes for a really good behaviour answer. But if you read this one, as I've no doubt you have or are still doing, here's somebody who is clearly learning on the job and presenting really their lack of confidence or where they are on the learning curve. And but there's no sense in the old star-based example format, which of course many people use for behaviours, and nothing wrong with that. There's no sense of a challenge or a task or a problem in there. There's no sense. There are lots of senses of actions, but no sense of the thought process that the person's gone through to try and tackle it, and no sense of what might come out at the other end, either in terms of success. So in that sense, it won't surprise you that this was scored really quite low. And here's another one, but this time for a behaviour statement, managing a quality service. Would you like to just cast your eye down that one? I think you'd agree with me that there's no lack of energy in tackling this question. It's got some dots at the end because it's not quite all there, because these days we don't necessarily set a word target. So sometimes people can do 110 words, 130 words, but some departments do still put 200 or 250 words on these. But what we've got here is a lot of list of activities, and this is a thing I want to get across to you. It's just so many people say to me, or they did in the old competency days, and they're still saying it now, I can't understand why I can't get through the SIFT. My boss has helped me ginger up my answers, and they were a whole lot better, but I still didn't get through the SIFT. And what I do is say, can I read it? And when I read it, I can usually see quite straight away what's in front of me. Let's say it's 250 words. Could be managing a quality service, could be about decisions, could be anything. And what you've got is buckets of background. So a lot of the words are wasted on giving us needless background. And then there's no sense of a challenge or a task that I, as an individual, had to solve. There might be something about the team, but we want something that is tough, if you like, that I tried to solve. And then the actions, and this is the bit that really gets me. You see people say, well, we had a conversation with the stakeholders and came up with an action plan, and then we implemented it. And then there's all they're saying, Bob's your uncle, we've actually done it. and solved it. So there's no sense of what they made of the problem, how they could have tackled it, why it was difficult, why they chose the approach they did. And then no real metrics here, because this is all just a great long list of actions. No sense of what came out the other end and why it was successful, why it was only partially successful, and what evidence we could bring to that bear. So both those examples, worthy though they are in some respects, are nowhere near what is needed to stop the SIFT panel in their tracks. I'm sorry, there are some wordy slides here. This is an advert, and I only bring it up. It's a real advert, a civil service advert, and it's in quotes because it's exact and verbatim. And I just wanted to point out here that it says, what, 1,200 words maximum for a personal statement, essential and desirable criteria. So we might have a mix of both of those. A SIF based on assessment of the CV and personal statement. This is my way of saying to you, you have to be able to read the advert absolutely forensically. Those words are key. Does CV mean it won't be an application form? Does it mean it'll be an actual application form with a boxes for your CV? What exactly? And then it talks about a 5-minute presentation at the start of the interview. And feedback will only be provided if you attend an interview. Pity that, but there you go. And then it goes on listing the behaviours. Leadership, seeing the big picture, delivering at pace, communicating and influencing, and leadership will be regarded as the one that they will use to cut the field down. So that's an advert, okay. And we get variations on this, and you've got to know it. Sometimes the behaviours don't appear in the personal statement, so you're just going to do it against the essential criteria. And sometimes, like the Department of Work and Pensions has quite often done, said these are the behaviours we'll assess at the interview stage, and so therefore you will be writing your own behaviour statements, if you like, to sort of learn, as it were, for the interview. And in fact, the panel will then, in those circumstances, not have anything written about the behaviours. They will simply be asking you to talk about the behaviours from scratch. Some departments are pretty unhappy about that, and so they've tended to weave the behaviours now into the essential criteria. That hasn't always gone too well, I have to say. And one of the things that I wanted to make the point about here is that adverts is a big, big problem in the civil service because they're so often pretty dull, purely bureaucratic, but worse than that, often wrong. I'll come to that in just a moment, but I wanted to just say, after 2 years of success profiles, this is what you have to contend with. Here are the upside. The civil service likes success profiles by and large. I've had people who've got reservations about strengths and so on, but by and large, I think it's a great change because although competencies were nice and predictable and you had it on your hard drive and all the rest of it, nonetheless, it had become formulaic, dull and boring and rigid. And believe me, panels could quite often tell when someone had mugged it up, or rather drafted it and mugged it up 2 nights ago, and that they were really just parroting out. What you were getting from them is not something from the solar plexus, but from their brain. They hadn't lived and breathed it. But of course, success profiles are broader and more transparent. If you've got useful experience, you want to know that's really going to count, and they will need to tell you that they're going to score that these days. So it's got a structured scoring system. Strengths means the person can speak. I mean, I think if I had 100 people who've been through some of these recently, many of them would say, well, actually, the strengths dictionary is a sort of thing that rolls into town only at the interview. We don't know what the strengths are. So in a sense, the person isn't speaking free form about their strengths. Interesting that, because the civil service, the Cabinet Office, and I can show you this later, have just issued an online strengths test related to the strengths that are in the strengths dictionary. So we've got a world appearing soon, and it's actually arriving right now, whereby you will have a strength profile at the outset, and that will be fed into the SIFT process. So people will be able to, as it were, characterize their strengths from the outset. and a broader evidence base, not just star-based answers, but you can answer them in different ways. But there's a downside. That the success profile system doesn't address the long-standing fairness and consistency issues. That's still down to the level of training that sifters and panel members of interview actually have. And in fact, that's pretty questionable at times. When I put those two examples of statements that I showed you on the screen up on the screen at Civil Service Live, we had as many as 400 people in the audience, and I asked them a very unfair question. If they were on the SIFT panel, what kind of score would appear into their mind, bearing in mind they don't know the job and all the rest of it? But we had a variation from 2 to 6. And when you consider that quite a few people have actually submitted exactly the same application for, say, an SEO job, having failed at the HEO job, and funnily enough, they've got through the SEO one. There could be reasons for that, with exactly the same examples. So we know there's lots of variability still to be sorted out. Vacancy holders just translating from the old system. I know this because I've traveled the country running events for vacancy holders who, when you say, well, what's the job description? What have you done with the job description? Have you analysed the job again and thought about it from a success profiles point of view? First principles. Have you thought about it from diversity point of view? And you get lots and lots of blank faces. So really, I think it was one vacancy holder said, well, what we do is just take the job description and just translate it from the old competency framework. And that's just not good enough. Diversity is not really embedded in here. We've got, civil servants go on unconscious bias training. Of course they do, and they're perfectly legal and so on. But we both know, and we all know, and I think Paul was referring to this earlier, there's a lot more to this unconscious bias, the tendency to select in our own image. And we have things in the system which I think encourage that, but I'll show you an example of that in due course. Strengths, as I said earlier, are an output, not an input yet. And so in other words, you're not asked the question to write in your personal statement, what do you regard as your strengths? We haven't got there yet, but maybe we will. And then recruitment adverts are still in the dark ages. Well, here you go. This is an actual advert. I promise you, I haven't changed a single word, the typeface, the layout, or anything. It's exactly as it appeared. And blow me down, it's September 2020. Well, just have a look, just have a little look down it for a moment. And what do you see? Well, I'm going to feed you the first one. It's pretty obvious that it would be a good idea if you're going to have behaviours like making effective decisions to have them bolded so we can actually see. What about external candidates who might not have yet picked up the behaviours booklet? So therefore we need to have those, it needs to be laid out in a way, otherwise it looks dense and dull. But much worse than that, the definitions are different from the ones in the behaviours booklet. So, not surprisingly, the candidates or people, many of them, ring in and say, well, hang on, am I answering your definitions or the ones in the behaviours booklet? Is this really the success profile system, or have you just adapted your own? That's not a helpful thing to do, but I worry about the people who didn't ring in and just had a stab at it. Would they be right? So, but not like this, therefore, or indeed like this. And I'm sorry, this is a screenshot, so it's a bit fuzzy. And it's again, it's a 2020 advert. Ignore the underlining. That's just a bit of word correction of the spacing. But I want you to look at this and spot the thing that you must not do. I hope you've spotted it. How come in 2020 we are still referring to competencies? So scores will be provided on all competencies for those who meet the, so here's an advert that's been concocted probably out of a template, and somewhere between HR's template and the vacancy holder, the thing has fallen through the gaps, and lo and behold, we've got something that refers to behaviours and it refers to competencies. We just don't need this kind of confusion. It's just not helpful. What I've been trying to say to you is that you have to be ready for this. You have to think through, how do you want to take yourself seriously, and you can't just do this the night before. You can't do it based on just resurrecting and cutting and pasting from the past. You want to get into the heads of the vacancy holder. What are they really concerned about for this job? They may not have cited a lead behaviour, but what is the core of this job? What are the things that will make the difference between success and failure? And as BAME candidates, you're going to need to let the evidence do the talking. It's not because otherwise unconscious bias will pull you down necessarily, though it might. It's the fact that when we were doing this webinar not so long ago, earlier this month, one of the things I talked about there was why we don't use more work sampling. That is, objective samples of how someone does the job. They're more expensive, they take time, and they get us more into something that looks like an assessment centre rather than just an interview. But we know evidentially that work sampling is a much better predictor than just an interview, because then the whole question of who somebody is, the colour of their skin, is not relevant. What's relevant is what they can actually deliver, and you're testing it. And one of the reasons why I think there's so much more popularity for presentations to be tacked onto the beginning of the front end of an interview is because it's the one thing that we can actually see that's directly relevant to the job. Not necessarily presenting capital P, but the idea of communicating clearly and actually seeing someone do that and testing it for live. Then we know. And I think we're probably going to have to get more into that kind of thing. But what I want to say to you is, and we'll come to this in the second part of this, is that when you answer your behaviours questions or the answers to your essential criteria, what you need to do is to treat it like it's a work sample. You're actually presenting, they can't see it, but you can describe it in such a way that they know that you've been there and you've done that. So we've got to get away from this kind of flat, two-dimensional, formulaic, star-based answers to something that is memorable. My test is at 4:45 on a day when they've interviewed 4 people, what will make them say, ah, Jamal, yeah, he was the one who said X. Will you be held in their mind? Will you have stopped them in their tracks? Will you have been memorable in some way or other, in such a way that the question of your background, accent, skin color is relevant because you can actually do the job. Now, I've come to the end of my first session and I've allowed quite a lot of time for questions, because in the second part, what I'm going to be talking about is the actual process of writing behavioural statements, thinking about interviews and how you actually come across, and in particular, what you can do to prepare for that. So there'll be more sort of tools and techniques. This one is much more about where your mindset is in relation to your own stuff, and how ready you are to give this a go.
See what I can pick up from the questions myself. And while I'm looking them up, Richard, just a quick one, because as I knew would happen, a couple of nuggets that you dropped for me anyway. I don't know about colleagues on the line. We'll see what the questions are in a minute. But can you say any more about this? I heard you talk about an online assessment that you could test, or at least get an assessment of your own strengths, that the Cabinet Office have launched.
Yes. In fact,
a bit more about that.
in my second one, I think I've actually taken a screenshot of a bit for the communication and went round to departments. But so there's something on customer facing. An expansion, if you like, of the before people apply formally or allowed to apply, they can do some online tests. We've known that verbal reasoning and numerical reasoning for years, that's been done, and sometimes more than that. But what they're proposing now, and I'm not entirely sure I understand the entire exactly how they're going to do it, but they've said to departments, we've produced an online work strengths profiling tool, which people will be invited to do online as they apply. And that would then be fed into the SIFT process. Now that's interesting because, of course, the sifters haven't had access to strengths data before. They're, the strengths only come into play at the interview stage. That's why I said strengths haven't become an input yet, but maybe they're about to do that. Now, exactly what that instrument looks like, I haven't seen yet. Yeah. How much of that profile you get fed back to you, how you'll feel about it in terms of how it presents you in strengths terms, I can't answer any of those questions other than saying in principle, I think it's quite a good idea. And I think people will feel that, the problem with the strengths dictionary was it's entirely owned by the other side of the table. No one's actually saying to me, what strengths would you bring to this task, this job that you think would really be the killer?
Well, absolutely. And I can almost sense that's what some of our colleagues are saying as well.
Absolutely. I'm sure they are. Well, and I think, can I just add to that? And because diversity is something that if you say to vacancy holders, what would diversity look like in this job? You very often get blank faces. They don't know how to surprise themselves. Yeah. But the people sitting in this audience do.
Absolutely. Well, there is the conundrum right there.
Exactly.
Thank you. Richard, at top of the charts with 6 thumbs up alongside it as a question, and it's a very pithy question and well put. I'm just going to quote from it. How do you put together a good CV if you have been in the same role for over 10 years?
Yeah.
How do you refresh? How do you represent yourself in a way that looks sparkly?
Well, clearly chimney stack careers, as they're very often referred to, are sometimes a bit of a trap to fight your way out of.
Yeah.
But I think people's heads tend to sink when they think that I've been typecast, so therefore I won't be able to do it. But when you start to think about, well, for a start, I mean, this is often not possible, but I think if people are in that situation, what's so important is them starting to spread their wings a bit, so they can get themselves on a bit of work shadowing, or they can broaden their role on some other kind of role. So the idea that you prepare yourself by realizing that you're light on this experience or that behavior is to try and actually come up with that. But just because you're doing the same job, jobs don't stay the same. And I think it's a mental kind of trap to imagine that, but you've got to fight your way out of that box in front of them. This really, and I would hear myself saying, for example, although that I have done this job, lawyer or whatever it is, internal audit for 8 years, it actually has presented very different challenges. And I would want to make sure that my examples and the behavior examples illustrate how I have moved out of the box, have become a much broader based offering to the market. Not always easy to do, because I'm not going to try and pretend that is sometimes difficult. However, we are, of course, moving down the road into more greater specialization, aren't we? And more professionalism. But everyone out there needs to think about, am I broad enough? It's what was called 2 or 3 years ago, the T-shaped civil servant. Depth and breadth.
Yes, I remember it well.
You do.
Richard, would it be wrong of me, and please put me right, but would it be wrong of me to suggest that in these last 7, 8, coming on 9 months, that many of us have had to work, if not in a completely different way, certainly in a radically different way? Would that not present an opportunity for us to look again at how we offer our best and convey that in a CV and
absolutely right. I mean, look, Rob, you're spot on there, because I think the predictabilities, if you like, have been relaxed a lot. You know, everyone's coming from a different position here, and so sorry, lots of different metaphors here. You can shuffle the pack of cards much more easily when you've been working at home, doing different networks, different kinds of things. And so, in a sense, I think that will act, I hope, to mean that panels won't be looking in such a sort of tunnel vision way, with a sort of a stereotypical way, but it's up to the applicants to shake them up.
Oh, absolutely. I literally, as you started your presentation, and because I was familiar with how to frame it, I literally popped into the other session just to hear a bit of Elaine Powell talking about communication.
I know Elaine.
And I was there long enough to hear her say to her audience that since lockdown, she's a commercial venture, obviously. She's ended up with more work and with more income because of her online position, enabling to deliver more. And that, brings a whole new dynamic. Okay, let's turn back to the questions and see. And that one, by the way, you've just answered. Thank you, Richard, is growing. More thumbs up since we've been speaking. So another question. I think there's another one here with 4. Here we go. I've not read it yet, so here we go live. With opportunities for growth in the same role limited, we have to apply for roles we may have less experience in, but more of potential for. How do we package that? How do we best express our potential? So with you on, relaying what we've done and being able to convey what we've done, and I think what's called behavior description in the old style of interviewing. But how can we best convey our potential?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, first of all, the idea that people are having to move perhaps into roles which they haven't got a perfect fit. I mean, this is an illusion, to be quite honest. I mean, I have, slight sidetrack, but I have quite a lot of people come to me who say, I'm actually having to be interviewed for my own job. And they're often much more scared than the people who are coming in from, winging in from, somewhere, left field. And I think that's part of the idea that somehow or other that we used to live, let's put it like this, we used to live in a world in which the person who is the current incumbent or very close by would regard themselves as having an advantage. And I have to say, some panels would undoubtedly fall into that trap. But my experience tells me that there are many selectors now who are trying to keep hold of the old world of predictability, but they are being so challenged, partly by people like me and by their senior line managers and SCS and people like Paul, to think outside the box. And I think the real answer to this question is you've got to stop looking at the job as though the job description is written in tablets of stone, that you've got to look at what's behind it. What would be a different way of handling that particular challenge? What can you bring from your own experience that up to that job that offers a different way of dealing with it? And therefore, and obviously your strengths are very important here. And I do know that quite a few people have a way of subtly weaving their strengths into the personal statements. And you'll know that the line from the Cabinet Office has often been, you can't really prepare for a strength discussion. I don't believe that for one moment. So you have to be a mug to do that, not prepare.
Oh.
If you haven't been through the Strength Dictionary, and all 36 of them, and thought, which ones of these have I got a really good story to tell? And that, I think, is really crucial to think about that. And then saying, but in terms of this job, what would that mean that I would be bringing something different? I'm going to talk a bit more about getting through the interview in situations like that in a moment. But the idea that you bring something that is to the same to a different role that you've not done before, and your head goes down and you think, well, I'm going to be an also-ran. That very often can be a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Your job is to say something that they have not thought of, to bring an advantage to the job at the interview stage. If you can get to the interview, your risk factor is the sift, because that's where the predictability will happen. The interviews, once you've got there, you stand a chance. I shall say more about that 12 o'clock.
Wow. Wow. Preparing for your next role, colleagues. Are you ready for promotion? Listening here to Richard and listening to those things that matter, the things that matter. Richard, we've got just under 5 minutes. Let's see if we can rattle through some real quick ones.
Okay.
Should the personal statement include the STAR approach?
I think a lot of people still do it.
Task.
Yeah, you can still talk about situationally how you characteristically handle a problem, but I think many people still use the STAR approach because they're used to it, and it's perfectly possible to adapt what your old style competency answers into a behavior-based approach.
Yeah.
And so the answer is, I think for many people, it is a very good thing to do. It's familiar territory, but they've got to remember what I said earlier about the STAR bit. I shall say some more about that in the second thing. It's the actions and the thought process, and what I will talk about, learning and transferability, but I'll come to that a little bit later.
Yeah. Okay. You touched on this earlier, Richard, and I wonder if you had any more nuggets. You mentioned about leaving that space, the interview, with a real memory, obviously a positive one for the assessment of the panel. To hold on to. Have you got any more tips about making your statements or examples memorable?
Yeah. Well, I often say some examples, and again, we'll come to this, is that you need to, it's your use of words, the way you describe things. So, for example, I had someone who was applying for a Band 1 SCS job, and she'd used the example of this involved several really grueling meetings with ministers. And I remember people saying to me, oh, I'd never use the word grueling. That would sound, as I'm criticizing ministers. And I said, no. There isn't a civil servant alive who hasn't dealt with ministers, who hasn't had a grueling occasion with ministers. And so that was spot on. And she, not for that one reason, but that kind of mindset got her into the SCS. She succeeded because at 4:45 they thought grueling. We know, and she told them how she handled that grueling occasion.
Yeah.
So words, metaphors, it's the quality of your examples that get you there, and the way in which you're presenting something that is unlikely for the other candidates to be able to replicate. More of that anon.
So, and you seem to be saying through that, Richard, don't be afraid of being honest or candid about the experiences you have. Just be ready to talk them through and explain how you have managed and led through.
Look, Rob, this is about being real.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, because they're uncertain of this process, turn up being a manufactured presentation or performance. Yeah. And I want people to be real and authentic. Yeah. That's what gets them through.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've got time for one more, and then we'll go for a break.
Okay.
A couple of repeat messages around STAR. I'm scrolling. Yeah, we've had that one. I'm on my smartphone with it, so it keeps shuffling back down.
That was my problem.
Yeah. There was a specific question around judicial appointments. You may not be able to comment, Richard, if you've not been directly involved, or indeed the nature of it, but there's something about whether or not the process for choosing our judiciary, whether you'd observed or been made aware of anything that they've done to make that more diverse or more inclusive. That was at the top. I'm paraphrasing.
I have been involved in, funnily enough, in the selection of QCs a few years back, but it's all changed since then. Yeah. I do know that I ran a session for the Supreme Court, and they seemed to be very keen on this kind of thing.
Yeah,
that was for the civil servants, not the judiciary.
Yeah, thank you. I've got the actual wording here now. Have you seen any positive change in the approach the Judicial Appointments Commission is taking in terms of applications and SIFT?
I wish I could answer on that. Don't know the answer, and I wouldn't like to predict to
Okay.
guess.
Well, Richard, we're bang on time. I'm going to park it there, not least of which because we've got more of your wonderful offering at 12 o'clock today. We've got another session in between, colleagues, but for now, in your own way, in your own homes, a round of applause for Richard, everybody. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
See you shortly. All right.